Whenever you're ready.
The defendant was a designated driver. The defendant was a designated driver that drove drunk. And because the defendant was a designated driver that drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Members of the jury, Vanessa Sullivan had just turned 21. She planned to go to law school. She was friendly, lovable. She had a family that loved and supported her. And on September 24th, 2010, she went out with her best friend and the defendant. She planned to have a good time, like any 21-year-old would. She planned to see a local band and enjoy her birthday. Vanessa Sullivan didn't plan to die. While they were at that bar, the defendant knocked back drink after drink after drink after drink, ignoring Vanessa Sullivan and ignoring Taylor Hobson. Maybe you've had too much to drink. The defendant refused to stop. When they left that bar, the defendant ignored Sam Lyons, cab driver. Do you need a ride home? Did you drink too much? I'm fine. The defendant ignored Vanessa Sullivan and her best friend on that drive home. Maybe you should slow down. You're going too fast. You're swerving. I'm fine. Members of the jury, the defendant was not fine. She was so intoxicated that she crossed 2 lanes and crashed into a utility pole and wrapped Vanessa Sullivan around a tree. That is why we're here today. Now, members of the jury, as prosecution, we had a burden of proof to you. We had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Danny Dawson, the defendant, is guilty of murder and driving under the influence of alcohol. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt just means that we have to provide beyond any doubt for which you've got a common sense reason. Danny Dawson was intoxicated when she got behind that wheel. You heard from Avery Smith that Danny Dawson's breath alcohol concentration was over twice the legal limit. The defense's own hired gun, Ashley Norton, told you that the defendant was too drunk to drive. We also had to prove that Danny Dawson is guilty of murder. Now, in order to do that, we have to prove that Danny Dawson engaged in reckless conduct that created a grave risk of death. Now, members of the jury, when Danny Dawson, the defendant, was tossing back drink after drink after drink in that bar, knowing that she was going to drive that night, that was reckless. After tossing back drink after drink, when the defendant refused to give up those keys, that was reckless. You heard from an accident reconstructionist that Danny Dawson, the defendant, was speeding. Not only was she speeding after she was too drunk to drive and knew it, but she was speeding while it was raining on a dangerous road. Members of the jury, how reckless is that? She ignored the pleas of her passengers, asking her, begging her, pleading with her to slow down. Now, members of the jury, the defense is trying to tell you that this accident was the cause of a missing guardrail. No. Had there been a guardrail on that side, it wouldn't have mattered. Danny Dawson crossed both lanes of traffic and smashed Vanessa Sullivan around a tree. Guardrail or not, she would have crashed that car. The defense is also trying to tell you that there was a deer in the road. Ask the eyewitnesses. Ask Vanessa Sullivan's best friend who was in the car. There was no deer that night. There was alcohol, and there was a needless trip that took place. Members of the jury, when the defendant got behind the wheel of that car, she didn't just take her own life into account. No. She took into account the lives of both passengers. Not only both passengers, but she took into account and into her own hands the lives and safety of any person she passed on that road. She could have crashed into anyone's car, killing anybody. Members of the jury, the defendant displayed indifference to human life when she took those keys. Every drink she had that night was an excuse and a reason not to get behind the wheel of that car. Members of the jury, it's not like Danny Dawson had 1 or 2 drinks and got behind the wheel. It's not like she even had 3. She had way more than that. She had so many we can't even count. And she expects you to believe that this accident was caused by a deer? No. This accident was caused by the defendant's recklessness. Danny Dawson deserves justice. Well, Vanessa Sullivan deserved her life. The defendant was the designated driver. The defendant was the designated driver who drove drunk. Because the defendant was the designated driver that drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Because the defendant was a designated driver who drove drunk with a breath alcohol concentration over twice the legal limit, she's guilty of driving under the influence of alcohol. Because the defendant refused to give up her keys and take a cab and chose to be reckless, tossing back drink after drink, because she didn't care what her passengers said, because she didn't care about the safety of anyone, she's guilty of murder. We are confident that when you go back to deliberate, you will find Danny Dawson, the defendant, guilty of murder and driving under the influence.
Thank you, counsel. Ms. Crowd?
Permission to take down the box. May I please the court?
Yes.
Opposing counsel. Members of the jury, over the past few hours, you've heard a lot about the events that occurred on the night of September 24th, 2010. You heard how Miss Dawson went to Chubby Sports Bar with a couple of her friends to celebrate the birthday of Vanessa Sullivan. You heard how Miss Dawson drove her friends home that night in order to try and make sure that her friend Vanessa would get home on time. And you heard, members of the jury, how that night resulted in a tragic accident. My co-counsel, Ms. Carlson, came before you at the beginning of today's trial and told you that Ms. Dawson was the one behind the white Chevrolet Impala. She was the one who was driving that night. Ms. Dawson takes full responsibility for this. She doesn't deny that she was driving the vehicle. Members of the jury, just because someone is behind the wheel of a car that crashes in a tragic accident, that doesn't make them a murderer. The prosecution in today's case held the burden. They had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Dawson acted extremely recklessly, that she showed a grave indifference to the value of human life, and therefore murdered Vanessa Sullivan. Members of the jury, let's keep in mind 4 very important words. Beyond a reasonable doubt. What exactly does this mean? Members of the jury, beyond a reasonable doubt means that if any point during today's trial you paused, you had to take a step back in order to look at the evidence before you, and you thought to yourself, well, that doesn't seem quite right. that doesn't seem fair to me. That doesn't seem just. The members of the jury, you cannot find Ms. Dawson guilty of murder. The prosecution today tried to show that Ms. Dawson was acting extremely recklessly. You heard that night that Ms. Dawson had been drinking at Chucky's Sports Bar. You may think, well, surely this is enough to prove that she was acting extremely recklessly. Surely if someone has been drinking and gets behind the wheel of a vehicle later that night, that's enough to show that they acted with extreme recklessness. But members of the jury, keep in mind when you're going over that evidence today, that here in Midlands, just because someone is driving under the influence of alcohol, that in and of itself is not enough to convict them of murder. It's not enough. So let's take a look at what else the prosecution tried to tell you today. They tried to tell you that the only reason that Ms. Dawson crashed was because she was speeding that night. Members of the jury, you heard from Ms. Leslie Roman that speed didn't cause this accident. That the way in which the ruts appeared on the road, the way in which the car moved and overcorrected, it wasn't due simply to speed. If it had been simply due to speed, the car would have crashed at an impact of 65 instead of 35. But the car slowed down because it was trying to avoid an obstacle in the road, members of the jury. The prosecution is trying to deny the presence of a deer in today's case. They're saying, well, Ms. Dawson's testimony isn't valid. There were no eyewitnesses to say that there was a deer. Mr. Bennett didn't see a deer. But members of the jury, if you recall, Mr. Bennett was 100 feet away from the scene of the accident. That he grabbed his shotgun when he heard his dog barking, because his dog barks at animals like that all the time. You heard from Mr. Bennett that animals do live near Kenyon Road. You heard that it's a highly forested area. It is entirely likely that a deer would have appeared on the road that night. Now they're saying that, well, Ms. Hobson didn't see a deer. Officer Foster didn't say anything about a deer. Mr. Bennett didn't say anything about a deer. But members of the jury, the only person who was able to see clearly that night while driving was Miss Dawson. Taylor Hobson was in the back seat. You heard her say herself that she couldn't see anything but rain from where she was. She couldn't see the speedometer. She was distracted, members of the jury. And just because she didn't see a deer doesn't mean there wasn't one. That, members of the jury, is reasonable doubt. Now, you also heard today that Ms. Dawson, on the night of September 24th, 2010, had a blood alcohol content reading of 0.19 when she was tested by Dr. Avery Smith. Dr. Smith conducted this test on the night of the accident, but it's important to remember that Dr. Smith didn't observe Ms. Dawson for the entire 15 minutes required by him by the state of Midlands to ensure that there was no residual mouth alcohol. You heard from him that he only observed her for 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. That's exactly 1/3 of the time that is required by him, by the state of Midlands, to observe subjects before administering such an important test. Members of the jury, these tests make the difference between jail time and freedom for someone, and it's extremely important that experts take these seriously. But you heard from Dr. Smith himself that he relied on the test solely on the testimony of Officer Foster, that he didn't see him drink any mouthwash or take any meds. But he didn't personally observe him for those 15 minutes. He only observed her for 5. Members of the jury, Dr. Smith didn't do his job. And because of that, Ms. Dawson's test results will forever be in question. That, members of the jury, is reasonable doubt. It is extremely important that when you go back to deliberate today, that you look beyond the tragic nature of this accident to the cause of this accident. Yes, what happened on the night of September 24th is undeniably a tragedy. A young life has been taken, and that grief will be felt by Ms. Sullivan's friends and families for years to come. Members of the jury, it's easy to get caught up in the emotions of a case such as this. It's easy to want to think that, well, just because Miss Dawson was behind the wheel that night, that surely she must be a murderer. That someone has to be to blame for something as tragic as this. Members of the jury, it is important that today you do what is just, what is right, and what is fair. Because Miss Dawson wasn't the cause of this accident. It was the combination of the conditions of the road that night. The rain, the lack of a guardrail, the poor lighting, the trees that were a mere 30 inches from the road, members of the jury. The deer that appeared on the roadway that night, causing Miss Dawson to try and avoid an accident, only to inevitably become part of another. Members of the jury, Miss Dawson is not a murderer. And as you go back to look over that evidence, you will find several flaws with the prosecution's case today. Several flaws that will cause reasonable doubt. Several flaws that will require you to find Miss Dawson not guilty of murder.
Is there any rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Okay, please, the court.
Yes.
What's easy? What's right? What was easy for the defendant was to toss back drink after drink. What was easy for the defendant was to get behind the wheel of that car. What was easy for the defendant was to speed down that roadway. What was easy for the defendant was to crash that car. What was right? What was right would have been to give up those keys. What was right would have been to get in that cab. What was right would have been to call for another ride. Did the defendant do any of that? No. The defense told you that it's not enough for someone to drink while to drive while intoxicated to convict her of murder. Well, what's enough? Was it enough that she tossed back drink after drink? Was it enough that she sped down that road? Was it enough that she disregarded the law? Or was it enough that she killed this young girl after wrapping her around a tree? Members of the jury, what's enough for the defense? I tried to tell you that this was a tragic accident. Was it an accident that the defendant refused a cab? No. Was it an accident that the defendant sped down the road? No. What was tragic is the death of Vanessa Sullivan. The defendant was the designated driver who drove drunk. And because the defendant drove drunk and did what was easy, Vanessa Sullivan is dead.
Thank you. Thank you all. Can you give us, you want to step out for 2 minutes?